Hello everyone, this is Jen and I make useful English Lit study videos on Shakespeare, poetry, fiction, literary devices and more to help you get top grades in the subject. So if this sounds like something you need, then make sure you hit the subscribe button below. Then make sure that you hit the subscribe button by clicking, make sure that you subscribe by clicking the black button below. So in today's video, we are analysing Alfred Lord Tennyson's poem, Charge of the Light Brigade, which is a poem published in 1854, the year when the Battle of Balaclava during the Crimean War took place. Before we dive into the close reading of the poem, we're just going to, as always, take a look at the poet's biographical details. So Tennyson was born in Lincolnshire in England in 1809 at the start of the 19th century, and he died right at the end of the century in 1892. So he lived a relatively long life. And he is widely regarded still as one of the most representative Victorian poets of all time, with his narrative epic In Memoriam making his career and helping him gain poet laureate status, which lasted until his death. He was a son of a rector and he was born into a big but poor family. So he was one of 12 children. However, despite his relative impoverishment, his father made sure that Tennyson had a decent literary education, and as a result, Tennyson was very well read. And he, from a very young age, would read poems written by Alexander Pope, John Milton, etc. So Tennyson actually got into Cambridge, but he didn't graduate, and he spent much of his youth in drunken melancholy, which was made worse by his father's death when he was at university, and also his subsequent discovery of family debts left behind by his father, which was subsequently settled by his grandfather. Tennyson published a series of poems in 1842, but they were all met with relatively little success. And it wasn't until 1850 when the turning point for his career really came. And that was when he published In Memoriam, which was inspired by a rather painful event, and that was the death of his close friend Arthur Hallam. It is an epic which covers an ambitious, sprawling range of sociocultural issues in the Victorian age. For example, struggle with faith, the rise of science, sense of loss, etc. And in 1850, he also married Emily Selwood. And from this point onwards, he exchanged his itinerant kind of wandering lifestyle for a much more stable, family-oriented existence, ultimately settling in the Isle of Wight. And actually, his famous short poem, Crossing the Bar, is about his journey towards the Isle. But even after he became poet laureate in 1850, it wasn't until 1855, during the Crimean War, that Tennyson cemented his reputation as a national poet, with the publication of such poems like Ode on the Death of the Duke of Wellington, and of course also Charge of the Light Brigade, which is the poem that we're going to analyse in this video. And these two poems were both patriotic verse at a time when Britain was fighting against Russian adversaries in the Crimean War. So before we dive into the poem, I also want us to understand why context is especially important for this poem. So if you're a regular student of literature, you will know that context can be helpful for us to gain deeper insights into the purpose of a text. And a starting question to consider is always, why did the author write the poem or the text in the first place? Now, of course, there are those few texts which we could argue on the basis of art for art's sake, that a poem or a novel was written just for the heck of it, and as such we can use a purely formalist approach like close reading to interpret it. But in the case of Charge of the Light Brigade, I'm going to argue that understanding the historical background is important for a top grade analysis, because it is a poem that was written largely for political and not poetic or artistic purposes. Because to be very honest, from a stylistic standpoint, Charge of the Light Brigade is just not quite Tennyson's best piece of work. When you think about it, there's little rhythmic variation, limited range of diction, and any sort of conceptual depth it may contain would seem to be somewhat overshadowed by the speaker's jingoistic tone. And if you've read his poems such as In Memoriam or Maud or even Tears Idle Tears, etc., you know that Tennyson is definitely very much capable of stylistic nuance and sophistication. But that said, our task as creative, thoughtful readers is to always find alternative paths to analysing and appreciating any text. So in the rest of this video, I'm going to be illustrating how Tennyson, apart from using this poem as a commemorative tribute to selfless British soldiers, is actually also delivering a subtle critique against war and its pointless demands on human lives, with very much what is a deliberate sort of stylistic and formal architecture that we're going to be diving straight into in the rest of this poem. So make sure that you stay till the end of this video for a top grade analysis of what's, well, not a very top grade poem, at least in my opinion. Now, the most striking thing about this poem upon our first read is probably going to be its forceful rhythm. This is a result of its dactylic meter, which goes da-da-da, da-da-da, da-da-da. And because a dactyl is a stress, unstress, unstress unit. So as you can see here, half a league, half a league, half a league onward. So the dactylic meter is reflected in the half a league, half a league, half a league onward. Now, I know that a lot of students tend to find meter and scansion intimidating, especially when it comes to technical terms like dactylic or even iambic, which is the more commonly found meter in English poetry. But the point to remember here is not the terminology itself, but instead what feeling the rhythm creates for you as a reader. So the question to ask here is, how does Tennyson's conscious, saturated use of frontal stresses throughout the poem make you feel when you read it aloud? Now, when we read lines like half a league, half a league, half a league onward, or later, cannon to right of them, cannon to left of them, cannon in front of them, etc., we know that's certainly not quite a relaxing or a mellifluous feeling, right? Rather, we feel that it's strong, assertive, and very much charged with sort of propulsive dynamism. And this, when coupled with the use of anaphora, and some of you may remember that anaphora is the repetition of the first word or phrase at the start of successive lines, such as half a league, half a league, half a league, or cannon to right, cannon to left, cannon in front in the third stanza. So coupled with the anaphora, the dactylic meter compounds the poem's forceful momentum. Now, on the most basic level, this kind of momentum mimics the sort of forward charging actions of the Light Brigade soldiers, as we see in line 5, right? When their commander tells them, forward, the Light Brigade, charge for the guns. But the triple lines of there's not to make reply, there's not to reason why, there's but to do and die, in stanza 2 here seems to also carry a sarcastic, critical tone. The message here being that, well, these soldiers aren't supposed to challenge or consider the validity of their commander's decree, because their task, well, is to simply execute those orders mindlessly. Now, what this does is reduces these 600 men to saber and gun-carrying machines, rather than humans with their own agency and identity. And this portrayal of the 600 men is also reflected in the verb-led subject, absence, and tactical construction of most lines. Now, what do I mean by that? Let's take a look at, for instance, lines 17 onwards in the third stanza. So instead of saying something like the 600 rode, or later they flashed or their sabres bare in line 27, or they plunged in the battery smoke in line 32 to 33, we notice that the subject or the pronoun is removed from all of these references. And this emphasizes not the soldiers as humans, but rather the conflict and the actions. Because we see that in these lines, the frontal stress is placed on the action, the verb, rode the 600, flashed all their sabres bare, plunged in the battery smoke. So the idea then is that in war, humans are secondary to the mission, and that in times of crisis, sacrifice is but a natural fact of life, and that collective thinking in service of a greater patriotic ideal is never to be questioned. Now that said, the speaker in this poem somewhat reappropriates the function of this anaphoric rhyme combination to grant these 600 men a sort of posthumous dignity as being first individuals and then soldiers. And we see that when he changes the connotation of the anaphoric word from being a war-related reference, such as the rode and flashed and plunged, etc., to a value-related one, the word honour. Right? Honour the charge they made. Honour the Light Brigade, noble 600. And we see the shift at the end of the poem, which we can understand as restoring these soldiers their human dignity.
By the way, guys, I'd massively appreciate it if you could hit the thumbs up button below, subscribe to my channel, and switch on that bell notification if you find this video helpful so far. This would really help me carry on making these useful English Lit study videos so that you can get top grades in the subject and we can inspire more people to enjoy the study of literature.
Now, another observation to make is the refrain in the poem, which is a recurrent presence. And this refrain contains the crucial recurrent phrase, the 600, which of course refers to the 600 men in the Light Brigade. As we can tell here, rode the 600, rode the 600, rode the 600 in the first 3 stanzas, and then not the 600, left of 600, noble 600. So you notice that it is the phrase, the 600, that recurs and repeats in every single refrain in this poem. So refrain then, as you can tell, is the same line that recurs at the end of each stanza in a poem. So it's actually both a kind of lexical and structural repetition. Notice, however, that the refrains in this poem trace a change in the narrative. And how does this work? So when we begin, we see in stanzas 1, 2, 3, the lines are about the 600 soldiers plunging headlong into battle as they unthinkingly charge forward to fight against their enemies. As we see in stanzas 1 and 2, the refrains are the same, which read, into the valley of death, row the 600. And in stanza 3, slight modification there, but still the same sort of idea, into the mouth of hell, row the 600. And later on, we're going to talk about the references, valley of death and the mouth of hell, when we get to the point about metaphor. Once the series of violent combative actions in stanza 4 concludes, with all the flashing of the sabres and the charging of the army, plunging the battery smoke, etc., once all of these actions conclude, we are given the result. And this result is tragic, not triumphant for the British soldiers, because we see that the refrain in stanza 4 reads, then they rode back, but not the 600. So by this point then, we find out that the 600 men have perished in the hands of their enemies. And the penultimate stanza, stanza 5, reaffirms their deadly fate, as the refrain reads, all that was left of them, left of 600. So the implication here is that, ironically, not much is left of the 600 men except for debris, bones, and the traces of their patriotic wild charge. Now, there are 2 interesting observations to make about the change in the refrain of stanzas 4 and 5. And the first is the tone with which the men's deaths are described. And second is also the fact that these 600 men are made to retain their place in poetic representation despite their actual physical ruin. So let's talk about tone to start. So one would expect the speaker to show much more emotion, either melancholic or indignant, towards the tragic sacrifice of his fellow countrymen, right? But this revelation of the 600 men's death is delivered in a somewhat matter-of-fact, blasé tone, almost indifferent, right? As if the speaker were just relaying a mundane, everyday incident when he says, oh, then they rode back, but not the 600. all that was left of them left of 600. This is sort of just kind of telling you the narrative progression of the event without much sort of emotional investment in the description. So this may seem odd at first, but the deeper implication here is that perhaps the 600 men's death will be perceived by many over time with exactly this sort of apathy, as their sacrifice is going to be viewed as a necessary part of a wider national mission. As a sort of matter of fact, of course this was going to happen, of course these men were going to die in service and sacrifice of their country's interest. And so this goes to show that cruelty in war isn't only manifested in actual bodily combat, but also, if not all the more, reflected in the cold social expectations of wartime sacrifice. Equally, it could be a reflection of the 600 men's stoic attitude and their emotionless embracing of their duty and their understanding of dying as a natural and expected destination in their mission. But the speaker's attitude towards it all is perhaps rather more conflicted. Because on the one hand, we could interpret from the curious anadiplosis of not the 600 men, not the 600. And you know that anadiplosis means the repetition of the same word at the end of the line at the start of the next line, right? So here it is, but not the 600. And it's also actually an example of tautology, because it seems rather redundant to repeat the word not again. But actually, this sort of tautological anadiplosis isn't unnecessary, because it conveys this sense of shock, as if the speaker is stuttering, the sort of not the 600 men being a kind of sudden, disorientating discovery on the speaker's part. And equally, the speaker also conveys a sense of waste, specifically his wistful desire to cling onto a past state when these valiant men were still alive. And this kind of clinging is reflected in the repetition of the word not. And so there's also this notion of wanting to preserve these men's presence, and it's likewise dramatized in their constant presence in each refrain, even after they die, right? Towards the end of the poem, we still see the presence of the 600 till the very end of the poem. And this overarches the poem's narrative by tracing the course of their climax of valiantly battling it against the Russian adversaries in the battlefield to their noble demise at the end. And so we see that retaining in lexical and structural form the place of these 600 men is central to the poem's commemorative theme and the public's patriotic imagination. Now finally, there are two more stylistic devices that I'd like to draw our attention to, and they are metaphor and metonymy. Now, if you're not sure what they mean and how they are different from each other, then you can check out my video about comparative devices here that I'm going to flash up on the screen right now. So the most striking set of metaphors in this poem is perhaps the valley of death, the jaws of death, and the mouth of hell. So all of these descriptions characterize death as this massive, vicious monster with an appetite so voracious that it can swallow 600 men in one go. And of course, there's also an element of hyperbole in these metaphorical descriptions. But more important, though, is the preposition that always precedes these metaphoric descriptions. And it is specifically the word into, right, as we see here, into the valley of death, where the 600, into the valley of death, into the jaws of death, into the mouth of hell. So what's so significant about this preposition into? Well, it highlights that despite death's overpowering cruelty, it is in fact the soldiers themselves who willingly embrace this fearsome chimera, right, as they plunge straight into this deadly fate, while knowing full well what's in store for them. So the more terrifying Tennyson's characterization of death, the more valiant and courageous these men charging into death would appear. What I think is equally interesting in this poem is the use of metonymy. So we see examples of metonymy in actually the phrase the 600. So the 600 is a prime example of metonymy because it's a stand-in reference for the British soldiers. And then there's also the reference to cannon in stanza 3, the triple anaphoric sequence, cannon to right, cannon to left, cannon in front, etc. And actually later in stanza 5 as well, right? Cannon to right, to left, cannon behind. And this cannon reference is a substitute for the combat and the chaos on the battlefield, right? Summarized as just this one singular reference, cannon. Or we also see the example of metonymy in the reference to shot and shell in stanza 3, actually in both stanza 3 and stanza 5, and also horse and hero, right, in specifically the phrase stormed at with shot and shell while horse and hero fell. The references to shot, shell, horse, hero are single reference substitutes for the multitude of injuries, deaths, and fallen soldiers on both sides of the battle. And some of you will probably also have noticed that shot and shell and horse and hero are alliterative sequences as well. With all of these observations, the million-dollar question will always be, well, so what? Why does Tennyson address the brigade soldiers in the arithmetic collective of 600 rather than calling them 600 soldiers, 600 men? Why does Tennyson generalize the enemy's attacks as cannon when there would be all different forms of artillery on the battlefield? And what is the effect of summarizing a valiant soldier's heroic fall with the broad brushstrokes of shot and shell and horse and hero? Now, if you recall, metonymy is, in essence, a generalizing trope, i.e., it communicates a larger related idea with a specific reference. So by extension then, the descriptive impulse here is to present a battle scene in sweeping, summarizing, and collective terms. Now, Tennyson doesn't do this because he wants to downplay or generalize the brigade men's efforts, but rather he's perhaps suggesting that in the grand scheme of history, these valiant men will meet the inevitable fate of being consigned to a general identity of just those 600 who died at battle for Britain at this one point in time. And that what's most unlikely to happen is that these 600 soldiers are going to be individually remembered for each of their contributions. So the bigger idea then is that by dedicating oneself to protecting the nation's interest, a soldier must give up any attachment that he has to self-identity and simply be resigned to the fact that he will go down in history as one of the nameless many who are collectively commemorated but individually forgotten. And that's it for this analysis on Charge of the Light Brigade, everyone. I hope you found it helpful for your studies and that it has inspired you to come up with some unique ideas about the poem. There are many other approaches and techniques that you can explore, so what I've covered isn't at all exhaustive as always. So if you're studying GCSE Power and Conflict Poetry, then make sure that you check out my analysis of all the other poems in the anthology, link in the description box below. Otherwise, please do hit the like button so YouTube knows to share this with other passionate, high potential lit students like yourself all around the world. And if you haven't already, please do hit the subscribe button below so that you never miss a future weekly lit study video from me so that I can help you get top grades in the subject. And I will see you all in the next video. Bye!